All right, so get organized here. All right, so welcome, good morning, happy Pi Day. That's it is 314, yes, 3.145698. Never mind. Welcome to the House Election Law Subcommittee on Voter Registration and Impacts of Non-Resident Voting. Representative C, would you mind leading us in the pledge? Pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. All right, well, we have a full quorum here today. Thanks, everyone. This is our fourth meeting, I believe. And I just want to take time to say I appreciate everyone having made the effort and contributed to this subcommittee. This will probably be our last official subcommittee meeting. There may be some offline work regarding a report to present to the larger election law committee, but in terms of a formal working session, this will probably be it, I think. Yes, sir.
Mr. Chairman, I think we have to have a formal meeting to approve the report.
Okay, so then.
I think that's one of the niceties that they want.
Okay, then we will, have let's take a moment and discuss that. We had a lot of extra time. There are several options that present themselves, I think. We were able, in the fuller election law committee, able to make our way through a number of bills last week at a faster pace than expected. I think that's possible for a number of bills. Would people be available for after the election law committee meeting for a meeting to discuss the subcommittee report?
Does it make sense to go before so that the bills could be discussed with the full committee based on a report that's adopted or not? Right.
That doesn't give us much time to do the report. Do we need to do the report before? Because I'm thinking we could do like a verbal one and then I just don't know that we have to have the written one to the full committee by Tuesday or whatever.
Yeah,
I don't know what the rules are. So
logistically, just thinking this through a little bit, the thing that we would need to do is that any proposed amendments to the bills before us would need to be ready by Tuesday for the executive session of the election law committee. With regard to the report itself, I do believe that we could issue it afterwards. This subcommittee, being familiar with all the discussions, could make the necessary amendments to bills as we see fit, and then have that. We could, I think, perhaps give a verbal report. I like that idea of, I just don't know that I don't know that we'll have time to complete a report and discuss it and all that beforehand.
But to answer your question, I'm sorry.
No, that's okay. I know I'm like on the side. I was just going to recommend that, we're not meeting till 10 a.m. on Tuesday. If we met at 9, like today on Tuesday, if we had to have anything finalized before we go into our session, perhaps that might be something we can entertain. if you think that's enough time to at least kind of have some type of agreement and report.
Do you have
I
a-
was just going to say that, yes, to answer your first question, I am available after Tuesday, although after, what do we got, 20 bills, 21? I can't remember the number that's on the list.
Yeah,
We
It's a
might
lot.
be, I mean, but I like Representative Burnham's idea, maybe at 9. I can do that too. But I live 5 miles away, so I don't want to speak for anybody who's going to drive more than 10 minutes.
Would noticing be an issue at all? I don't know the
We-
rules
we
on
could-
that.
We could notice it for 9 o'clock on Tuesday. We could meet for an hour and then we could recess and then continue the meeting afterwards as necessary that day, I suppose. Again, I really appreciate everybody's efforts to help bring this across the finish line. That's a long day on Tuesday, but that may prepare us for Thursday. So, so that should be, yes, Representative C.
I was just looking at the calendar and, Thursday, Thursday, April 3rd is the last day to report all remaining HBs. And I'm not sure whether this list for next Tuesday is the final list or whether we have one more executive session.
Are those second committee bills?
Some of them are FN, so they would be, and
No, but I meant that date. Is that for second committee bills or is that for?
that's for all bills. The last day to act on, House Bill, I'm sorry. Thursday, March 27th is the last day to act on House bills not in a second committee.
That's crossover day, right? So,
So crossover is April 10th, but they have to be acted on by the
By
full
the-
House.
right. So theoretically, that was the 27th?
Yes.
So theoretically, it's possible we could do something on the Tuesday before. Okay,
Um, It's the 18th. Actually, this one probably is our last, the 18th is probably our last
Last.
one because the other would only be 3 days before the deadline, which is not enough time to notice.
right.
My understanding is that's everything, because the chair asked me to give him a list of what I thought we had left, and I probably asked Representative Burnham too. And then I think our assistant, Robin Bach, also gave him a list. So I think that's how he put that together, trying to capture everything
Yeah.
that we had left.
Now, we have already exec a couple of the bills that were on the
Yep.
subcommittee list.
Yep. Yep, that's okay. All right, well, I think, so I think it's up to us to try and adopt any amendments. We can do that individually. We don't have to do that as a subcommittee based on what we've learned from here, but I did want to do a couple of things. Oh, first, I just want to always, I forget this sometimes, so I want to read the mission statement. Was at the direction of the chairman of the Election Law Committee, this bipartisan subcommittee is tasked with evaluating, consolidating, and reconciling various 2025 House bills concerning voter registration and the impacts of non-resident voting. Accordingly, the subcommittee will review the proposed legislation with attention to constitutionality, any necessary alignment with federal election law and legal precedents. The subcommittee will consider historical context and opportunities to clarify current regulations. The subcommittee will issue a report to summarize its findings, conclusions, and recommendations. All right, so, what I'd like to do is, Representative Lane, if you could speak to your bill briefly, I'd like to speak to House Bill 289 at some point and communicate some information that was provided to us outside of the meeting of the subcommittee. And then I'd like to go over some discussion points paper that I've presented. So if you are ready to go ahead, please do so.
Thank you. So this is HB 385, and I do have an amendment, but it's not all that. And I handed out last week what I was trying to get as an amendment and marked up the sheet. So, but the goal of the bill was to essentially overturn HB 1569 and put us back where we were before that bill was passed. And so what I did, if you look in your purple book, and I didn't do all of the OLS was mostly, but they did a great job, it was to go back to what's in our purple book. So I know it looks really long, but 1569 was a big bill itself and kind of completely overhauled the bill. So in order to put it back the way it was, that's why the bill's so long. And I can go through it page by page if you want, but that is the goal. And
I don't think we need to take a vote that the subcommittee does not want you to do that.
right, I can't imagine that you would, but I just made that lovely offer. And
appreciate it.
so I have copies of the full amendment. I did get them back from OLS.
Okay.
And I can pass those around, and I have them ready for Tuesday. And so there we have that. So that's the short version. I'll go
Okay.
longer if you want, but
No, I see we have the honor of Representative Lynn joining us. Did you want to speak to us today, or are you just listening in?
I apologize for being late, but I knew you had the absentee ballot bill.
There you go.
Yeah.
So I just.
Oh, I need the-
I
yeah.
just wanted to come in here.
Oh, thank you.
these are the 1, 2, 3. That's the full amendment
Okay,
without the markup,
all right, thank you.
which I can give you again, but I'd have to go upstairs to get copies. But,
Right. Okay,
But I gave last week, and so I did, because the chair asked me to go through and compare it and see if I missed anything. And so the changes that are on page 17 and 18, those were the changes that when I compared it. So,
okay.
so that's it.
Did you know that your bill is actually longer than 1516?
Yes, I know, because with
Subsection
putting
for
everything back
repeal,
in,
yes, right,
putting
so-
everything back
right,
in
okay.
made it longer, but yeah.
All right. Very good. So, all right. So, what I'd like to do right now too is just discuss one bill that is mine actually, and just explain some concerns that have been brought to my attention. Last week when we were meeting, we did not have a full quorum, but the subcommittee did not formally meet during that time when we were waiting for a full quorum, but outside of the subcommittee, there was some testimony from Mr. Clementowitz and Mr. O'Brien regarding House Bill 289. And I'll just relay a couple aspects of that. And then I'd like to get into the discussion points paper that I've distributed to the subcommittee here. So Mr. Clementowitz of the ACLU noted that, so House Bill 289 is regarding domicile qualifications for voting and makes some changes to the RSA 654:1, Roman numeral 1 and 1A, and had some statements about domicile being claimed if a person is a legal dependent under custody at an address outside the state of New Hampshire, and then also add some residency rules as established by the University System of New Hampshire. And Mr. Clementowitz made note that from a couple of perspectives, that the tax perspective is not under the control of the voter necessarily. And there was some concerns about the confidentiality of tax returns. How would this be enforced? How there's no payments being made to New Hampshire. Therefore, does New Hampshire have a right to those tax returns and those sorts of things? And taxes, perhaps not always proof of physical presence, but and even the tax law allows for temporary absences due to student requirements. So there are those aspects that he communicated. So he thought the aspect of a legal dependent under custody at an address outside the state of New Hampshire had issues with it, both from sort of a privacy aspect, a enforcement aspect, and just a constitutional aspect, because it's not under the control of the voter whether or not a person were to claim that. And then Mr. O'Brien made note that the University System of New Hampshire establishes residency at the time of application. Is that actually, Mr. O'Brien just walked in, so I'll, if you wish to come up and specify that again as a formal testimony, Mr. O'Brien, that would be great.
Sure. Thank you, Mr. Chair. I'm gonna have to find the statute real quick, but my name is Mike O'Brien with Party Strategies, representing my client America Votes. And on the UNH website, as it talks about in-state tuition, the first sentence is residency is determined at the time of admission for degree students. And so, again, tying in-state tuition to voting, I could I could rent an apartment right in Newmarket for 4 years, but if you tie qualification to in-state tuition, I wouldn't qualify if I didn't necessarily, because at the time of admission, and that's obviously a problem, right? If I live and rent a place for 4 years, maybe that turns into 6 years, who knows? But I am eligible to vote, right? Like that is very clear. And then their admission standards, this goes back to the same conversation that Mr. Clementowitz had brought up, which is to say the sentence that it continues to read, to qualify for in-state tuition status, a student and or his or her parents, if a dependent, must physically reside in New Hampshire. And so this, again, is tying someone, it ties your right to vote to someone else's ability to claim you as a dependent. And that is problematic for a lot of reasons. Again, as was stated by Ms. Clementowicz, my right to vote is mine. I can't control if my parents claim me as a dependent. If they don't, that's a decision for them, not a decision for me. But that is not how we determine voting laws, for good reason, right? Obviously, it would get very messy if someone else could determine where you were able to vote. And probably a lot of us wouldn't like that very much. And so that is, it's right off their website where I pulled this from. But the rules for being in-state tuition in UNH are far stricter for them than it is what our rules to register to vote are, or would be allowed. So.
Thank you very much. Are there any questions from the subcommittee? Representative Ling.
I don't really have a question per se, but I recall that we had somebody here from UNH, their lobbyist, and I think she testified in much of the same vein that you did. Were you here when she was here? And I can't even remember what
I
bill
can
it
barely
was.
remember yesterday at this point. I don't, I'm not sure. What I will say is and I said this to the chair last week. You know, I think I said this to the committee. This is my, I think 12th or 13th year in front of the election law committee in the House through my work, and I have seen a version of this bill a number of times, and there was actually one in the Senate earlier this year too. And I don't want to be very clear that I do not represent the university system. I have no ties to them, and so, but I do know from hearing this, you know, one of obviously the concerns is that if a student received in-state tuition solely because they registered to vote and not based on the rules, it would cost the university system. I mean, it would bankrupt the university system. It feels like I'm not speaking for them, and I want to be very clear, but it would certainly be a huge cost to the state. So that's a separate issue, but it is tied, and I'm sure that came up in their testimony.
Yeah, no, thank you, and anyone interested in that can look for the testimony for the Senate bill to find out the pertinent facts of that. That was it was testified, and the amount was discussed. It was quite high. So okay, seeing no other questions, thank you very much, Mr. O'Brien.
Thank you, and I'll be here for the rest of the
All right, great. All right, at this point, I'd like to go over a paper. It's a 4-page paper for those who are looking in here that I've labeled discussion points, and it's my attempt at really trying to consolidate all the information that we've heard, as well as a number of the court cases that have been identified by our researcher, Mr. Allen, and trying to put all this together as best I could for the subcommittee's review. So let me just give a broad introduction to it. And then, and I apologize, we don't have any other copies available. I suppose we could get some more made if people are interested, but so what I sort of identified from the court cases, the research that's been done, the testimonies that we've had, is that there are really four, if you will, main issues. And the first one is proof of citizenship. I'll just introduce them at a high level first and then go into detail on all of them. The second one is the standards for identification. The third one is non-resident voting or non-resident voting. And then the fourth one is really absentee ballot applications. And just to, I might refine those titles a little bit later for the final report. But basically what I've done is I've outlined a series of aspects of each issue, identifying it as a problem statement. What are the adverse impacts? What is the proposed solution? What are the proposed changes? And then what are the RSAs that need to be changed? And then what's the supporting legislation or legal cases? And there might be some other information on the form as well, depending upon the topic. For proof of citizenship, the current RSA requires documented proof of citizenship for registration. And to some extent, that is New Hampshire's absolute right as a sovereign state. Here is that we can require that only U.S. citizens, or and this is law, only U.S. citizens can vote in federal elections. There's a court case about that very specifically. And New Hampshire has a right to restrict voting in state and local elections to U.S. citizens. However, per the National Voter Rights Act from 1993 and the rules of the Election Assistance Committee, only, and I'm quoting here, the applicant's signature attesting under penalty of perjury that the applicant is a United States citizen is required for federal elections. So they don't have, for federal elections, in order to comply with the National Voter Rights Act, an applicant does not necessarily need at that moment a documented proof of citizenship. So that makes that the only qualification where an applicant may self-attest to a qualification, but for the purposes of federal elections. So that self-attestation has to be accepted by New Hampshire for federal elections per the National Voter Rights Act. So what's the adverse impact? New Hampshire must allow signature attestation for federal elections. The definitive proof of citizenship does not have to be provided on election day. And so for federal elections, some voters will not have provided full documented proof of their citizenship qualification. So how do we deal with that? So this is what I'm proposing, is that we sort of establish fully qualified voters and provisionally qualified voters. Fully qualified voters will have provided documented proof for all the qualified voter criteria. A provisionally qualified voter will not have provided all the documented proof required to be fully qualified. And applicants must provide documented identification for registration. And if they don't have that, at least for federal elections, I think we have to minimally provide a provisional ballot of some sort for that election. And if applicants do not provide sufficient documented proof of their qualifications afterwards, they would be removed from the voter checklist. So provisionally qualified voters may attest for the voter qualification of citizenship for a federal election. And I would propose that voters who self-attest citizenship in federal elections are permitted to vote by federal-only ballot. That is a practice in a number of states. Representative Lynn, did you want to make a comment to the subcommittee? Please, you're welcome to do so. We would welcome your sage advice.
I'm not sure how sage it is, but I guess what I would say is I think, and I certainly stand to be corrected, I think that we're not subject to the national vote. We are not covered by that, as I understand it, because I mean, candidly, that's one of the foundations of 1569 that we passed last year. I'm well aware that states that are subject to the National Voter Registration Act for citizenship, that there's that case that says, the Supreme Court case that says if you sign, it's good enough to just sign the affidavit. But as I understand it, we are one of, I'm not sure how many states, I knew at one point, but I've forgotten. There are a few states, including New Hampshire, that are not subject to, that are exempt from it. And so I think that it's based on the fact that we are not subject to the National Voter Registration Act, we are not subject to that requirement of that the only way that it's sufficient to prove U.S. citizenship to just sign the affidavit.
It, if I may ask a couple of questions of you, are you willing to take a few questions or at least raise some comments here?
Sure.
Yeah.
No, I didn't expect to be doing this, but I'm happy
Yeah,
to.
yeah.
I'm happy to try. Sure.
I appreciate the ad hoc participation. So very, very much appreciated. So certainly the National Voter Rights Act from 1993 has certain requirements. The requirement that most people are familiar with is what they call the motor voter aspects, where you are automatically registered to vote with your application for a driver's license. To my understanding, that part, as you correctly said, does not apply to New Hampshire because we had conditions already in place and we have registration on election day, and therefore those conditions allow us to exclude ourselves from the motor voter aspects of the National Voter Rights Act. However, and again, I stand to be corrected if you want to do some research over the weekend, is that it's my understanding that because there are federal election aspects in the National Voter Rights Act that do not require, it's this aspect of citizenship. You don't require documented proof. You can just sign off. And that aspect might still apply. That's what my and that, maybe I've divided the question here, but inappropriately, but I think that's my understanding from looking at is that aspect would still apply to us. I could be wrong about that.
So you know what? I guess what I was, I as I said, if I had known we were going to have this discussion, I would have. But
Correct.
I thought that the exclusion, that there was a section of the National Voter Registration Act that said this act doesn't apply to, or these states or something like that.
Right.
This act doesn't apply to these states. As I recall, and again, I wish I had it in front. I don't think that it said sections 1 and 2 and 3 or something of this act don't apply. I thought it just said this act.
Okay.
So I understood that to mean that that the National Voter Registration Act simply didn't apply to the states that were exempt. But I wish. I wish that I had something here in front of me. And I guess, I have to say, if the part of the National Voter Registration Act that says you can satisfy citizenship by signing an affidavit, if that applies to New Hampshire, then I have to say 1569 is unconstitutional. I don't think because it says you have to provide documentation, and at least as to federal elections, I think I'd have to concede that it was unconstitutional. But I don't think that that's the case, and I guess I would have thought that if that was the case during the debate, because 1569 was hotly contested, I would have thought that during the debate on 1569, somebody, Mr. Clementwitz from the ACLU or somebody that opposed it would have said, wait a minute, I know they made various arguments that the law would be unconstitutional. I understand that, and I understand there's a law, but I don't ever recall them saying, wait a minute, you can't do this because we're not exempt from the National Voter Registration Act as to this provision. If they had said that, that would have been, the case over. Because I would, concede that if the requirement that you can, you can satisfy citizenship by an affidavit applies to New Hampshire under the National Voter Registration Act, then at least for federal elections, we don't have any choice. We have to comply with that. As I say, I don't think that that's right. And I think that if the opponents of 1569 had such a slam dunk argument for why it was unconstitutional, they would have made it. And I don't recall ever hearing that argument. So I think that may not be the case.
Thank you very much. Yes, Representative Lane.
Thank you, and thank you for taking my question.
Sure.
Having been one of those opponents, we did raise a concern about this act, and we're afraid that it would in fact take away, that 1569 would take away the granting of the exception that we have from the National Voter Rights Act, and that because of that, we would then fall into the requirements of the act. And we were concerned because the state worked so hard to get the exemption, that then we would be in the Motor Voter Act and then we would be falling into this. And we asked for an opinion, but we're never given it.
But I'm sorry, respectfully, Representative, that's a different argument. That is a different argument. And I don't disagree with you. You did make that point. But that's not an argument that the National Voter Registration Act applies to us right now as to this provision, and therefore you can't do this. That's like saying, well, some other provision. You're basically, if I understood the argument, and I think I did, it was you are making it's so onerous to register on election day, to have election day registration, that in effect, there's no longer any same day registration because you've made it too onerous. And therefore, if a court were to conclude that, they might say, well, that means that you no longer effectively have same day registration, and therefore the conditions of your exemption don't apply. Is that an argument? Yeah, it's an argument. Maybe you'll win it. I have my suspicions about where that may not prevail, but I could be wrong. But that's a different argument than the one I'm talking about.
I know, but we did raise this act. All I was trying to say is we did raise concerns about this act and had asked for some guidance, and we never got it from either from the AG's office or from the sponsors.
Sure. No, I hear you. All I'm saying is, if the issue that has been raised by the chair here was, if that were the case, I would have thought that you, or somebody else would have said, "Wait, this is crazy. Why are you even going forward? We are subject to this provision of the National Voter Registration Act, and therefore you can't do this." And if that argument had been made to me, I would have said, "You're absolutely right. We can't do this." But I don't think that that's correct.
Representative C.
And thank you for taking my question. You had mentioned possibly unconstitutional. Was that actually in violation of the Constitution, or just not in compliance with the Federal Voting Rights Act?
No, well, I mean, it's they're sort of related. In other words, what I was saying a moment ago is, if the section of the National Voter Registration Act that allows a person to satisfy the U.S. citizenship requirement simply by signing an affidavit. If that section applies to New Hampshire, then under the supremacy clause of the U.S. Constitution, we could not comply with that, at least for federal elections. We could not comply with that. And if we passed a law that didn't comply with it, it would violate the supremacy clause of the Constitution and therefore would be unconstitutional.
Thank you.
Representative Newsom.
Thank you. Even assuming New Hampshire is fully exempt, would it be allowable for us to basically recreate that federal only registration affidavit requirement within our laws?
In other words, I think, yeah, I think we probably, in other words, I suppose New Hampshire could say, even though we are not subject to the National Voter Registration Act at all, we are going to, at least we're going to draw a distinction between federal and state elections and say that at least for federal elections, or I suppose you could say, in terms of if we're not subject to the law, to the federal law, I suppose we could say either for only federal elections or really even for all elections. You could say, even though we don't have to do this, this is what we're gonna do. For the reasons that we had the debate on 1569, I would say, I would say that was a bad idea, but could you do that? Yes. The only other thing I would say is I would really strongly suggest this, and I would hope this might be something there'd be bipartisan agreement on. I think it would be a really bad idea, even if you could do this, to draw a distinction between federal and state elections. I think that's what Arizona, which is subject to the National Voter Registry, that's what they did. And if you look at what's going on there, it just seems kind of crazy of having this two, the elections are held on the same day, but some you get to vote for these, the federal offices under one criteria and state offices under. Boy, I do not think that's a good idea. And I would hope that, there would be bipartisan support on not doing that.
I don't disagree with you on that. As a new representative this term, I'm not as familiar with the whole debates on 1569 since I wasn't around for that session. But I appreciate the viewpoints on all that. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Well, as you correctly stated, the law does say, I pulled it up, and it does say there is a section in there talking about non-applicability to certain states, and the first provision is where there is no voter registration requirement for any voter in the state. And I think there's one state that falls under that category, one of the North Dakota, perhaps, I think. Yeah. And then the second clause under that is a state in which under law that is in effect continuously on or after August 1st, 1994, or that was enacted on or prior to August 1st, 1994, and by its terms has come to effect upon the enactment of this act, so long as that law remains in effect, all voters in the state must register to vote at the polling place at the time of voting in the general election for federal office. So, if I could ask, just when it says under law that is in effect continually, one can still amend the law.
You know what? My recollection is that what the Congress was concerned about, and I think a legitimate concern, was they didn't want they were comfortable saying that whatever the states were that either didn't have voter registration, the one North Dakota, whatever, or the states that allowed same day registration, if they had a sort of a history of allowing same day registration, as New Hampshire did, as of, and I think the date that's referred to in there is the date that the National Voter Registration Act would become effective. Those states they wanted to exempt, but I think what they wanted to avoid is states deciding, oh, we don't want to be subject to the new law, so we'll now change our law to allow same-day registration. I think I think that was what they were trying to get at, is if you've already done this, for a long period of time, fine, we'll exempt you, but we're not going to allow new states to decide to exempt themselves by passing new laws.
So just to clarify, then the aspect that is probably talking about is really the same day election day registration.
I think that's, it was the way you read it, it was worded. It sounds like it was worded maybe a little awkwardly, but I think that's what it was saying, is that same day, you can register on election day.
Yeah, yes, that sounds correct. So, all right. Any other questions from the subcommittee? Not at this point. Okay, thank you.
Thank you. Thanks so much.
Appreciate it. And again, I appreciate the ad hoc impromptu testimony. Mr. O'Brien, I see you are eager to approach the microphone.
With some of these questions as well. Michael Bryan, Party Strategies with America Votes. So yes, we have a full exemption from the NVRA. So start there. Continually does reference election day registration, and Maine, for instance, repealed their election day registration shortly after 2010, I believe. They then lost their exemption from the NVRA, and then they put it back, but they still can't get their exemption back. So now they fall under both. They have same day, but they also fall under the NVRA. So once you remove the ability for every voter to vote on election day, your exemption from the NVRA is immediately either put at risk or rescinded. It has to go, there's a process obviously, but that's part of it. To the federal having two elections point, I agree with the representative that it's a bad idea. We'll say we cannot do that. We have one checklist in this state. All of our laws govern all of elections. We do not have, like Arizona, the ability to bifurcate our elections, and we should not bifurcate our elections. But as of right now, as we stand, we could not say rules for federal and rules for state like Arizona does. We have one rules for all of our elections, minus, of course, town meetings, which we don't classify as elections, right? And so there, that is, I just want to be very clear on that. That's also not an option. Also, just briefly to your point about provisional ballots, because we had this debate about 418 a couple of years ago, the Constitution says that the ballots have to be counted at the same time. And that's defined as like, you can't, like, even if you're counting at 6 a.m. and you start at 11 p.m. or 9 p.m. or whatever time, you can't, go home and come back and finish counting. And so provisionals have always been deemed to be something we cannot do here because of that, because we can't not count someone's ballot and then turn around 5 days later or whatever the case may be and count them. So I just want to be clear with the committee on that as well. And the last thing I'll say is on 1569 and the law that was passed, we just had our first election on Tuesday where this law was in effect. The Campaign for Voting Rights had observers in, I'm going to say 10 to 15, 20 spots across the state. We are aware of 46 voters that were turned away from being able to register or be able to vote on Tuesday, which is really high for the number of places that we were in and for the type of election this is, right? So town meeting day, you think mostly as voters who are, you're not getting a lot of new registrants on town meeting day, right? This isn't a presidential election where there are lots of folks coming in, including a woman from Hampton who brought both of her kids. She also had her ID. She had her birth certificate, but it did not match her maiden name. And so she was unable to vote because her birth certificate did not match. And so because of that, she was turned away. This, to Representative Lane's point, I think does she was not allowed to register on election day. Does this put us in violation of of our exemption to the NVRA? It might. It certainly, I would hope, would lend pause to think about, should we be, I mean, I don't think it's reasonable to believe this woman was trying to create fraud, commit fraud, showing up with her 2 kids and all of her documents except one document that linked her previous name to her current name. That would be a pretty crazy thing, it feels like, for me to do. And so we have now seen this in what is generally a pretty small election, and it had a pretty outsized impact. And so just want us to be aware of that as we think about moving forward and what we want to try to do. You know, we obviously we can debate voter fraud probably the end of time with, I imagine, some folks on this committee. But what we do know is that proof of fraud is pretty limited. And I would, without having to think about this at all, never have we seen 46 cases of fraud in one election, certainly not in a town meeting election. And we just saw 46 voters turned away at a town meeting election. And so as we weigh what is an outsized impact, right, I just want us to be aware and think about that. So glad I was able to hopefully clear some of those questions up that we had. And obviously happy to answer more if I can, but.
You are willing to take a few
Sure,
questions?
of course.
Representative Newsom.
Thank you. Of those 46 cases, how many were women versus men?
I don't
If you
have
have
the
that
data in front of me,
information.
but I'm happy to try and see if we have all of that. We just had observers there, right? So they were watching, they were to see, and I don't know what their notes look like, to be
Okay.
totally frank. Yeah.
And that's only, those 46 were only where you
Where
had
we
staff.
were. Correct.
So there were many other locations
Correct.
that were not staffed. So the true total number could be much higher.
Correct. And I would expect that it would be.
Okay.
And we said this before, but what we saw in Kansas when they did the proof of citizenship as a requirement was about 30% of voters in the 2-year span who registered, and I think that's 12,000 voters, were turned away from registering. It is why, the other thing I will say about this is not just the court said that you can't require citizenship, federal court, circuit court, because it takes too long to get a passport, and it is often too expensive to get a passport. So it's not just cost, but it's also time, right? We know it can take 4 to 6 weeks, sometimes longer than that, to get your passport. And so if a voter wants to vote and doesn't have that document, it takes them a long time. When the court looked at that and those 30,000, the state's own expert who went through the list to see how many of those folks were citizens found that over 99.9% of them were. And so they turned away 30,000 voters, almost all of whom, by the state's own expert of that law, said, yeah, these were citizens and they should have been allowed to vote. And so, and that tracks with, the reason I bring that up is because that tracks with the numbers that we saw on Tuesday, where you're not having a ton of folks register, right? Again, it's a town meeting day. This is not, same day registration is not super high on this day, but you would see of 8 people who attempted to register, 2 of them were turned away. Of 7 who attempted to register, 3 of them were turned away. We pretty consistently fell in that 25 to 30% of people turned away, which is totally in line with what we saw in Kansas when Kansas passed a similar, although actually less stringent law than what we saw with 1569. And so I'm not totally surprised by those numbers. They are in line with what historically we would expect based on other states who have tried this.
Do you know if all of those individuals were turned away simply for the qualification of citizenship?
I do not know. Again, I do know that 2 were turned away because they didn't have their ID on them to vote. So of the 46, I know that 44 of them were turned away because they lacked a registration document. I do not know if it was strictly citizenship or if there was another document they were missing. Again, I can try to get that for this committee if we have it. I am not aware. And I don't want to mislead, certainly. So
Right. So these are individuals who had not been previously or 2 of those individuals were individuals who had not been previously registered, and they had no identity papers.
no, so those 2 that I'm referencing, sorry, are previously registered voters who showed up and did not have their ID on them to vote. So they were on the rolls previously. Obviously, I could have signed the affidavit. I would have had my picture taken. I would have gone through that whole thing. And as someone who has shown up once to the polls without their ID on them, I sympathize with that. I'm happy to. It's always an embarrassing story, but driving back from the Peterborough Players to Francistown, New Hampshire, as you imagine, it's a lot of back roads and a lot of darkness. And I took the wrong turn and then made a U-turn on the road that I was on because I needed to go back, and all of a sudden flashing lights were behind me. The cop, I think, expected to find a drunk teenager, but found a dad with his wife who just returned from a show. I explained, he let me go. I put my license in my jacket pocket that I was wearing because I was going to see a show, and so I dressed up a little bit. That was a Sunday. On Tuesday, I went to go vote, pulled out my wallet. My ID wasn't there, right? I got my picture taken. I went through the process. I did all of that. That's the voter we're talking about. They showed up. They pulled out their, wallet, whatever, and they did not have their ID on them, and they were told they were not allowed to vote. So those are previously registered folks, but who no longer could sign the affidavit due to the law.
Okay. And you're are you claiming that providing identification is a burden?
I'm not. I'm just telling the committee what we saw on
Okay.
Tuesday, and asking the committee just to think about as we move forward, whatever recommendations come from the subcommittee and the full committee, that when you pass laws that affect folks, rights to vote, right?
Mm-hmm.
That the consequence of that can sometimes, and this is I think this is just part of the overall discussion that is had, right? And I think what Ms. Clemento had said, right, is what is the cost versus the benefit? And so I'm not saying that, we shouldn't have laws and people should just be able to, do whatever they want to do. But I am saying to think about, for instance, with all these absentee voter bills that we're seeing, right? If there is a voter who is homebound, and we heard this from the disability community, right? That there are voters who use affidavit ballots because they struggle to be able to get to a clerk's office or leave their house or do the things they need to do. If we are affecting their right to vote, what is the counterbalance to that? And it is taking the vote away from a duly legitimate voter, right? Is that being made up for by whatever law that you're passing? And I would just say again, 46 voters in a town meeting election or 44 to register is just, the number I expected, totally honest, I thought we'd see 5, maybe 10 for the type of election that this is. 44, 46 that we know of, again, it blew me away that the number was that high. And I just think, it shows what is the impact appears greater than what we were trying to solve, because we know the affidavits, we're never producing those kind of numbers, right? Occasionally you would catch a person who committed fraud and they were then prosecuted for that act. But we never saw 46 in an election or anywhere close to that, right? I bet in the last 20 elections, we didn't see 46. And so impact versus what you are, purporting to try to stop, I think it's just an important thing to keep in mind as we move forward.
Yeah, I don't think we yet know the nature of those 46 cases, so we don't know if they lack of proof of citizenship or
Yeah, all we
Yeah,
know is they
we
were turned
don't-
away, right? They showed up and were told, no, you
Right.
are not allowed to vote.
right. So I think so if they were not able to prove domicile, if they were not able to prove citizenship, if they were somehow not able to provide their identity or their age, then those are the voter qualifications. And
Correct.
so if any of those criteria were not met, they would have been turned away.
Correct. Yep.
So, okay. So I think, while the caution is heard and well advised, I think we also need to make sure that we understand exactly why these individuals were turned away and what the situation was. Okay, well, thank you very much. All right.
Mr. Chair,
Yes.
I just want to point out that when Secretary of State testified, I can't remember if it was on 1569 or 1370. I kind of get them confused sometimes, but he said that removing qualified voter affidavits for citizenship would affect tens of thousands of New Hampshire voters who could not otherwise be quickly verified as being previously registered through the centralized voter database. So yes, we need to wait to see. I agree on those 44 before we would rely on that. But we also have testimony from the Secretary of State from a year ago that he knew that it would affect tens of thousands of people if they put in the citizenship qualification. That's all I'm saying.
Well,
just wanna bring it- I
yeah.
just- I just want
no,
us
it's-
to
it's-
remember that he
it's-
said that.
it's a good point. And granted, it was a local election. I'm not sure that 46 or whatever the number is amounts to tens of thousands yet. But that was the general. So usually there's my experience is that there's a 4-to-1 turnout ratio for, or maybe 3-to-1 sometimes for general versus a local election. So if we ended up getting more, it's still, I don't know that we're hitting that tens of thousands threshold quite yet, but not that that's a,
I didn't expect that we would
yeah.
on town
Yeah.
meeting day.
right. Not that that sort of threshold is acceptable, but I think what's important is that we need to understand why these people were turned away. And, we always have to balance, the necessity to conduct our elections in a manner that provides confidence to the voters that we're conducting it with integrity and that we're doing the necessary steps to prevent or mitigate potential fraud. And I people often bring up the question about fraud, and I think the greatest problem with fraud is that it is fraud. They're trying to deceive. I think what's most easily prosecutable, and that we see the AG constantly doing, is those individuals who choose to vote in two places are most easily caught. So one of the aspects of this whole fraud discussion is detectability, and someone who votes in two places has increased the likelihood of the detectability of fraud. And I think that's the nature of some of the aspects of why we don't see perhaps larger aspects of fraud being discovered. All right, so
Mr.
yes.
I understand that you're never going to have a system that is 100% just because it's human and we're all human. And if somebody really, really wants to commit fraud, they will find a way to do it. So I think we just need to be careful that we don't take a sledgehammer and disenfranchise tens of thousands of people because we think maybe 10, 15, 44 people are going to sneak through and do it because it is the right to vote and there is a balancing act. And we just need to be thoughtful about how far are we going to go to exclude people in order to maybe prevent those other 44 people from voting. I don't know, but I just think we need to all keep that in mind when we go through all of these bills. What are we trying to do? And is it really in the best interest of the state to disenfranchise people?
Well, I think the state does not have any interest in disfranchising people, but I do think the state has obligations to make sure that the elections are held with integrity. So, and to not create anything that is overly burdensome for voters. But I mean, that certainly cases like Crawford versus Marion clearly discuss that. So, all right. Yes, Representative Burnham.
Yes, thank you. I just wanted to make a comment. So I had the privilege to work on Tuesday as a ballot clerk, and in the short time that I was doing that, we had two voters that came. They were new residents of the town and showed their driver's license. Unfortunately, they weren't on the list, so they were told that they needed to go and give additional information to the supervisor of the checklist. One of the two, I believe, had to go home to get that information, but in both instances, they were fine. They wanted to comply to what the law was. They didn't, have a problem with that. And then they did come back and they were able to vote. So I think that is working. So that was just, I wanted to just share my actual experience in at my table for my short time that I was able to be there, that the same two people that were rejected to get their ballot did the process and then came back. Even if it was 45 minutes later, they were fine to comply. So thank you.
Representative C.
I was just wondering if it'd be worth our while to formulate a couple of questions for the Secretary of State to get us a response in terms of the number of people who were turned away, and he may have to solicit that information from town moderators to find out. And also his take on our exemption to the federal regulations, and maybe some other questions as well.
Yes, thank Representative Newsom.
I don't want to put words in your mouth, but your previous statement sounded like you were saying that you believe that fraud is in existence in the state and that the problem is we're just not catching it, in which case, wouldn't the proper solution to that be providing more funds to the AG's office and increasing their voter fraud department so that we can catch those cases that might be out there, rather than cutting the ability to vote? Since, as Representative Lane said, a fraudster is going to be a fraudster. And then it's a matter of catching them, which the registration process, the voting process won't catch the people that you're referring to. It would be the later investigations in the AG's department would be the way to solve that. Just a thought.
Yeah, thank you, Representative Newsom. I think both the Secretary of State and the AG's office deal with, if I may, two types of problems that occur that potentially challenge election integrity. One is non-compliance. Simply someone is not following the basic rules in a proper way, and we see this a lot with electioneering aspects or other. Down in Hudson, we had a number of questions raised because a private entity put up electronic signs that appeared to be very similar to what the town uses. And several people contacted myself and another representative who also happens to be a selectman. I'm on the budget committee, but for that town, but contacted me and another representative about these signs. They thought there was improper electioneering going on. And, after investigation, my fellow representative from Hudson determined that no, in fact, it was a private entity who had hired it and they were doing everything properly. And We communicated that to the AG's office and actually got a response within a day from the infamous Dick Tracy. And that was a pleasure getting that email. And we were able to, at least, alert them that if anyone complained from Hudson, this was the situation going on, and this should be a low priority because we had already helped them with a number of aspects of what would have been an investigation. So to me, that is what I would classify as a non-compliance situation. I think they deal with that probably 90% of the time. I think the fraud is, as I said before, the detectability aspects of it are much more challenging, and the most obvious detectability aspect is when a person votes in two places, because then whether it's two places in New Hampshire or, as we've seen in recent prosecutions, someone in Massachusetts and someone in New Hampshire. So, or somewhere in Massachusetts, somewhere in New Hampshire. So I think a lot of their focus and efforts is, perhaps in addressing those aspects, and perhaps it's not in increasing the detectability of fraud, for lack of a better statement. I haven't thought this through, so I'm just kind of speaking offhand, but I think that is something to be considered. In the industries I work in, I do a lot of data integrity audits, and I've actually had the pleasure or displeasure of discovering fraud and having to then document that, and having those companies having to take actions against people who were committing fraudulent actions for monetary gain. And so the problem in those cases is the detectability literally takes months or years to discover sometimes. And that's a certain number of events have to accumulate before you can detect a sequence of data points that show something is off. We've got an anomaly here. Then you have to investigate the anomaly, and then you have to go further into uncovering what, you have to do the forensics to determine what was done. And then, and only then, you begin to tie, is there a motive or an incentive for this person to have done it to then prove the fraud? It is a very long and cumbersome process. I know this at least from a data integrity standpoint, having been involved in several of those myself. Having said that, I would imagine that the AG's office and the Secretary of State face similar challenges. So, all right. If it's okay, so I think I've received good feedback on this issue number 1, things for me to consider. For the standards for identification, issue number 2, yes.
Before we move on, I just want to say that one of the potential solutions, even if we're not, or we are, or whatever, if we're going to do the NVRA, National Voter Rights Act, is that, and I think it was actually I don't know if it was Mr. Clement, I can't remember who first proposed this, but the government holds the birth certificates and evidence of, and we are the government. Secretary of State has the ability to allow the clerks, I think, to get, so at least for probably all the males over 18 who were born in New Hampshire, we could just give it to them or make it available to them, or I don't know, just pull it up and see if it's there and solve that problem. So nobody has to run around and get it. And, thankfully those people had it at their home, but, I know I have mine, but I'm not sure my husband has his at the house. So I just wonder, is there a way that we as a government, and as somebody said yesterday in one of the speeches, we are the government. So could we not make it a little bit easier for people to get this, and get acquisition to it? And if those federal databases ever become available, then, we'll be able to get to those too. But is there some way we could consider that we could help people get these, and particularly with maybe neighboring states or others in the solutions? And I don't know if that's too radical to embrace at this time, but it just seems an easy solution, and then at least reduces the number of people that have to worry about this.
Representative C.
In following up on that, it would seem to me that it would also be possible for the secretary to, at least for the women who were born in this state and married in this state, to be able to track the name change due to marriage.
That's an excellent idea as well. Both of those are excellent ideas. I think if we can make, if the state has the wherewithal to make some of this process easier for voters to prove their citizenship, then we should endeavor to do that. There are some that, people who have moved from out of state who may not have that information. There is, I think I read it in I forget where I read it actually. I think there was some court order. It may have been Arizona versus the Intertribal Council, or it may have been one of the other cases. But there was a series of databases that secretaries of states could avail themselves of. Not Eric, sorry. But that would allow them access to birth certificates and things like, or at least documentation or proof of citizenship. So I think there are some other aspects that might be helpful. So Representative Newsom, you had a comment?
Yeah, this is, of course, just pure speculation, but with the current administration's attempts to get rid of birthright citizenship, potentially in 18 years, birth certificates won't even be evidence of citizenship. So we may have a whole nother round of issues. Just, again, that's pure speculation and down the road and well beyond the scope of this committee today. But just wanted to point that out as a thought.
Yes, there are many, many countries that do not have birthright citizenship. So that is, although I never like kicking the can down the road, I am glad that I won't have to worry about that aspect. I hope to be very much retired by that, if Lord willing I'm still alive. Oh, yeah, would you like to speak? I'm sorry.
That's okay.
Please go ahead.
Representative Weary and members of the committee, my name is Kate Horgan. I'm here on behalf of Secure Democracy, and something that Representative Lane just triggered something in my head. So Secure Democracy in West Virginia instituted a law that allowed their DMV to share their records with the Secretary of State's office, something that already exists in New Hampshire on a limited basis. I have language that would, let me back up. The DMV, when you get your real ID, scans your documents and keeps them. New Hampshire has a 63% uptake on real ID, which is higher than the national average. So they have people's birth certificates, social security numbers, whatever they've done to prove their citizenship, they have that and they know if it's that document versus a green card. I have language that as soon as I get back to my computer, I can send to the committee that would allow the Secretary of State's office and the DMV to share that information, and the Secretary of State's office could add a column to the voter checklist. Yes, they prove citizenship, or leave it blank if not. It would be very simple. They're already sharing that information. I've spoken to Director Marasco over at the DMV. He said it is not a problem to add that information shared to the Secretary of State's office. So if that is something this committee is willing to explore, I'd be happy to share that language with you. And then it expands it beyond the 1/3 of people who were born in New Hampshire, and it would apply to anyone who has a real ID. We've also made the language an opt-in, so that way, because we have the right as individuals to delete information if you want to delete your photo, so that way only the people who wanted to share their information that way would be able to.
Would be able to.
Yep.
Right. I think the subcommittee would very much welcome your suggestions. And if you would endeavor to send that to us,
I can do it in the next 5 minutes.
that would be awesome. I think so. If you would send it to the entire
I'll send it to the
subcommittee,
5 of you. Yep.
that would be great. We would very much, and if you could also copy Chairman Berry and.
He already has a copy of the language.
Okay, all right, great, fantastic.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. All right. Yeah, I think clearly when someone is eligible to be a voter, if the state can do whatever is possible to assist them in demonstrating that, then I think that's a good thing. So we want to help out our voters, our legitimate voters, as much as possible. All right. I should have asked this before. Any further comments on the proof of citizenship issue? All right. All right. The second one is the standards for identification. Right now there are some allowances for other photo identifications that are not issued by a government agency, either by a state or federal agency. And so there are some questions that have been raised in some of the bills that we are evaluating as to whether or not those are adequate, and without going into the details behind why there's some concerns about that. Just say that a New Hampshire issued ID would indicate both the domicile qualification being met and as well as the identity aspects and the age, of course. If you show up with a New Hampshire driver's license and a passport or a birth certificate, there would be no issues there. And so I think just there are some merits to having government issued identification forms, and I think one possibility is to take advantage of that sort of concept and to adapt our RSAs to do that. And we have at least one bill, maybe two, I forget, that address this. And I think that would be a good idea. The question is, I think that should be something that is done both at the time of registration and at the time of obtaining a ballot. There are some, just in looking at other states, there are some states where if a person forgets their identification, they don't have an affidavit, but if two or more people know them, they're able to sign an affidavit as witnesses that they know this person and that identity established by their attestation, by their oaths, actually. So that's one alternative method that is used when someone does not have a identification for the purposes of obtaining a ballot. We use the photo aspect in our current law, I believe. And I'd like to hear from the subcommittee about any concerns or other considerations that, with regard to using a government-issued ID. Representative Newsom.
On your very thorough 4-page handout for the discussion points, you list that the quote problem statement is that the current identification requirements for qualification permits various forms of identification, and I challenge that is in fact a problem. That the identifications that we allow today require the photo, signature, and other requirements, and it's just not a problem, in my opinion.
Thank you for that comment. I think perhaps I did not state that problem. This is the problem of having long session days and then trying to do this thing, trying to prepare this information late at night in preparation for a subcommittee meeting the next day. So sometimes the thought process is perhaps not fully captured. I think it's the subjectivity of reasonable evidence. So let me try and answer some of your points, which I think are valid based on the statement I've made, but let me try to explain that further, elaborate on that. I think there is sometimes some subjectivity to what is reasonable evidence. I think there are also some concerns that other types of identification being used may not have the same standards that the government uses to establish identification, and therefore there are some concerns about that aspect. And so I think, and those are sort of my 2 points, is that some entities issuing identifications do not necessarily have the same government standards are not under government control, and therefore not under our control and out of our control for the purposes of identification. And then to some degree, the subjectivity of reasonable evidence. And we may need, do we need to, in fact, make that less subjective and more objective, perhaps? So I think the proposal, what I would propose is that we do require government-issued identification forms. We do need to, the current RSAs do allow for the photo and things. I still think we ought to have some aspects where people then subsequently provide that identification information so that the Secretary of State doesn't have to go chasing it down or anything like that. So,
Okay. Yeah.
Representative Lane.
Are we talking about to get a ballot or to register? Because they're very different issues.
Right. So, now so I think those are two activities that both require identity, right? So I think, registration requires you prove 4 things. Once you're registered, you only need to prove your identity. So I don't, And so I'm fine with that. I still think in both situations, I don't think a person should ever get a ballot if they can't be identified. I'm,
And
you
we're
know,
not, we're not, I don't think anybody suggested that. I
Okay.
guess what we've been thinking about and what we've heard is not to conflate the requirement for registering, for
Right.
domicile, for proving domicile with the question of ID. And for example, when I first moved to my, I moved all of 10 miles within Concord, but I went to a different ward, so I had to go in. And my ID to identify myself had my old address on it. I had registered with the DMV, but I was too cheap to pay for the new one, so they had it in their records. So when I went to hand my ID, it didn't have the same address on it. So I took a utility bill just in case there was any issue because I'm on this committee. And so, um, but, but that's an instance where, you know, I just pulled out my driver's license. I didn't really think about it, you know. So I think for ID purposes, it's a very different scenario. And I think for the students who have their student IDs on them all the time, particularly if they don't have a driver's license. So, I mean, I didn't have a driver's license when I was in college because I didn't have a car. So, it just means, part of me is like, look at what the purpose is. If we're trying to prove identity to give somebody a ballot who's already registered, it doesn't have to be government issued. It just has to prove that they are who they are. And I think we had a lot of testimony on that.
And you're specifying that for obtaining a ballot as opposed to registration.
Exactly.
So same day registration, that would not be acceptable though.
I didn't say that. I was just addressing one thing at a time.
Yes, yes, indeed. So I think, I mean, that is the challenge. If we can just speak frankly here, is that if a person is not already registered, then I think there are some challenges there, right? And I don't think we're not creating the two classes of citizens. I mean, that's the get to you in just a moment, Mr. Bryan. We're not creating a two classes of citizens because we're ostensibly requiring definitive proof of identity for registration. And I think it's incumbent upon New Hampshire to have that kind of requirement. And if in fact, someone in your situation who has a situation similar to what you discussed, is that they don't have a government issued driver's license. New Hampshire does have a non-driver identification card that is obtainable, much as we suggested for the birth certificates and marriage certificates within the state. We should look into making that available at no cost or very nominal cost, to be able to definitively do that. But I think, again, I would require that for registration, and it may be possible to have other forms of identification, but for registration purposes, I think it is incumbent upon us to really keep that threshold high for the purposes of the state conducting the election with integrity, and I don't think that necessarily creates a a burden. There are many places where government IDs would be required, where in your example, you could not use a student ID. So, Mr. O'Brien, did you have a comment for us?
Just very quick, sorry.
No, we welcome your input. This is not a, we don't claim to be the bearers of all knowledge. So we are certainly welcome to have input from you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair. For the record, Michael O'Brien with Party Strategies here on behalf of America Votes. A couple things just want to, as we think about ID, specifically to Representative Lane's point, also under the law right now, right? So if I produce a non-government ID, I also have to produce a government document because I have to produce my birth certificate or my passport. So, and my passport would obviously cover also identification. But my point is there's like, it's not like you're producing something that the government has given to you in order to register to vote. I would argue that, for instance, UNH is covered under a government ID because it is a state institution and therefore is produced by something the state governs. So if we're saying the UNH ID is okay, but the Dartmouth ID is not okay, I don't really know how that works or why that would be acceptable. I also like Dartmouth is a really big employer here. They're a big part of the state, as is BAE, as is, right? We have like a lot of these employers. I guess my question, to back up, I would just say that you are always producing something now to register to vote that is a government document, right? And so, and I don't know, I mean, obviously if I showed up with my 5-year-old's picture of me and I said, here's that he drew, and I said, here's my ID, I think the moderator would say, I don't think so. Right. Also my kid love him at 5, not this is, I don't believe it's his career path. So, but I guess all I'm trying to say here is there is a, you do have to show some government documents in order to register to vote already. And also, that we should trust our moderators. I think they are being judicious in what they accept, that they understand that, the ID must be reasonable in order to prove, and that we are showing other government documents to register beyond the ID.
And yet 46 people were turned away. So
Because they didn't have an ID, but that's a different, or because they didn't have one of the proofs, one of the for our proofs, which is different than, again, showing up with, I show up with an ID from, I used to work in the State House, right? If I had my State House ID, I don't think I ever had a State House ID, but let's pretend I did for a minute, right? I showed up to that. Would that not have counted, even though it's like I'm a State House employee? It just feels like and I would challenge the committee to think about and to ask, and I am fairly certain the answer to this is no. Has there ever been a case anywhere where someone showed especially New Hampshire, an ID from BAE and they weren't who they said they were, that they had somehow doctored the picture to change so it matched their face, but provided the name of someone who was on the checklist? Like, at the end of the day, what are we getting at here? Who do we think we are? What problem do we think we are solving? Do we think that people are showing up with non-governmental IDs and saying, I'm such and such, that they are pretending to be a different voter who's on the checklist? Are they registering as a different voter? Ultimately, what is the problem we're trying to solve? Who is this person that we're trying to stop from doing something? All of it feels like any ID from a large business, from a school, from whatever the case, is enough evidence that it's got your picture, it's got your name. That is the evidence we are looking for. And then you either have to produce other documents that match, right, with your name and these other things, or you already have done that through the registration process.
Right. I appreciate those comments. I do think the standards that the DMV exercises are, and the identification that they provide, may be more than may provide more information than some of the company identifications or company cards and stuff like that. So,
I guess I would
it's
say BAE.
Well,
Yeah,
there are, yeah. And I'm not sure that I would necessarily count the University of New Hampshire system as a government agency. I'm not sure they call themselves that. I don't think they do on their websites. And even though there are people who sit on their boards who are also are government agents and of that sort, I'm not quite sure about that. If we could classify University of New Hampshire system as equivalent to the Department of Motor Vehicles or things like that. So I'm not sure about that line of reasoning, but that is an interesting question. All right, thank you very much. Representative C wishes to speak, so I will.
Yes, in terms of the proposed changes, I was thinking, two things. One, that there may be justification for at least certain circumstances or all circumstances of somebody, getting a non-driver's ID of not having to pay at all.
Yep.
So, whether it's limited circumstances or all circumstances, for this voting aspect, it doesn't matter what, so long as the person can get one. The other one that Representative Lane just happened to talk about was the change of address without having it on your driver's license. I moved from Keene to Concord and then from Concord to Loudon. And in both cases, I did not get the updated license, but I never ran into a problem with it. It just didn't happen to be an issue for me. But, Representative Lane had it addressed.
No, I remember changing addresses from Nashua to Hudson and getting a sticky, with the new address on the back, and it was like, okay, I admire and deeply appreciate the prudent cost-saving measures implemented by New Hampshire for such measures. So I think with that in mind, that is something we need to consider. Again, I think the possibility of easily detected voter fraud because of an address change for that reason is we need to find a way. We should make sure that if there are address changes that have occurred, that we account for, some evident, you can, if you're not pre-registered, let me think about this. If you're pre-registered, I think the laws already account for just switching. You can notify someone, I'm already pre-registered here. I need to switch over to here. And so I think that's possible. All right. Any other comments on the standards for identification?
I guess I'm still not sure, when you say standards for identification, is this just for getting a ballot or is this to prove residency? Because in my mind, they're two different issues.
I would say, thank you again for that comment. I think the fundamental issue is for registration.
Okay.
Because I think it is incumbent upon New Hampshire to have qualified voters. So who meet the 4 criteria, and we are able to do that. Yes, Representative C.
I think that in answer to Representative Lane's comment there, I think we do need to identify 2 different standards of identification, one for registration and one just to verify that you get a ballot.
Right.
Yeah.
Even if they end up being the same.
Right. No, but no, that is an excellent point. Thank you for stating that. I think that really is a good point. We need to, I'm not sure it's intuitively obvious. We have certainly under the registration aspects, we have identification requirements. And I think we probably have something similar, but we should make sure within the RSAs that that those two activities are understood as distinct and sequential, and that there is perhaps a very objective standard required for registration. I don't want to say that there's a lesser one for obtaining a ballot, but if they're getting a ballot in person, and they're already registered, we need, there might be the two standards might be the same, they might be different. Probably need to kind of think about that over the weekend, make amendments and present it to the committee on Tuesday. But Representative
Yeah,
Lane.
I don't want to beat a dead horse necessarily, but I come back to the fact that we have no evidence that this is a major problem. If people are not confident, I mean, there's been a special commission, the governor, two secretaries of state have said we have safe and secure elections. Nothing's perfect, but to require everybody, to assume that everybody has easy ability to get to, just to get to a DMV station, office, and it just seems that we are requiring things that we don't need to, because there's not been a problem. Why do we have to eliminate and fix a system that doesn't appear to be broken? Again, I know how, you all know how I feel, so I'll be quiet.
Thank you for your comments, Representative Lane. Always appreciate it. Please. And do the introduction as
Yes.
well again.
Kate Horgan, I'm actually putting on another hat. I also represent the New Hampshire Association of Counties. So when you are thinking about absentee voting, please remember everyone in your nursing home votes absentee. Not everyone in the nursing home has a photo ID, and they may or may not have all of their documents. They may be with another family member. And right now, under the law, a nursing home administrator can verify someone's ID. So please just think about that, because if you require additional documents, that means more costs and more work for not only the nursing home, but also those in the jail. Because if you restrict it because about 80% to 90% of the people who are in your county correctional facilities are there pre-trial. They aren't convicted, so they still have the right to vote. If I happen to live in Manchester, if I run, yes,
Did you say 80% are pre-trial?
yes.
Oh.
Because the counties only accept people who have been sentenced to a year or less or are pre-trial. So I think the last time I talked to Rockingham County, out of 140 prisoners, 118 were pre-trial. So I'll just give you an example. I happen to live in Manchester. If I commit a crime in Exeter, I'm going to be held in Brentwood. The superintendent is not going to allow me to leave to go get my birth certificate and my documents to vote, nor is the Manchester town clerk going to come to Brentwood to verify my identification. I will point out, county corrections and county nursing homes are in a unique position. We know who these folks are. It's not like we're like, oh, John Smith is just in bed 18. We know who they are. They're likely on Medicare and Medicaid. They've been verified by the federal government. So please, when you guys are looking at those requirements for absentees, I suggest you pull your county delegation hat out and put it on and think about the costs that it will impact your county. And I see a couple questions that I'm
Yes,
happy to take.
Yeah, I'm just making sure I get this on my notes. Because those are That's a good question. Representative Burnham.
Yes, thank you. Thank you for taking my question. Do you know how many inmates actually do vote by absentee ballot? And I'm aware of nursing home, but
Yeah.
this is the first I've heard
So
about the
I don't
inmates.
have numbers, but I do know what the superintendents have told me is if they still have their voting rights, then if they ask for an absentee ballot, we facilitate that occurring and happening. Now, are some people in the jail for a couple hours? Are some people in there for significantly longer? I know Hillsborough County had someone who was in their pretrial for over 2 years. Presumably there would have been an election in there at some point, and if he wanted to vote, he still had the right to vote.
Okay, thank you for taking my question. Would you distinguish between the county nursing home and other nursing homes that are in the various
I
cities and
would not.
towns?
I would suggest that that would be a problem for all 73 nursing homes in the state.
There's 73 of them.
Yes. And 11 are county nursing homes. COAS has 2.
Okay. And I just was going to point out that in some cases of misdemeanor, somebody may be in there for prison term, convicted, but are still eligible to vote.
Correct.
And also, we already have in the RSA somewhere, and I don't remember which one it is, considering that the person inside the prison is considered away from their hometown.
Correct. That is an option on the absentee ballot form.
Does the subcommittee have any other questions? So just on the nursing home, so because of the Medicaid or Medicaid, Medicare, there's a vetting and identity processing that goes on for people.
When you apply for Medicare, Medicaid, you have to provide documents, social security numbers, things like that. Our concern is right now, so a lot of people who are young adults, their parents may have their birth certificates rather than themselves. That switches when someone enters a nursing home. Oftentimes, that the nursing home will not hold a birth certificate or a marriage certificate or anything like that. It would be held by the family, who may or may not live in this state.
I don't think the federal government's going to give out money unless they're very sure that that is the person. I'm just having applied for Medicare and having had to work with Medicaid applications. It's onerous.
They're
and
very detailed.
they're very thorough. So, but no system is perfect.
I would suggest to the committee that you consider keeping the exemptions for nursing home administrators to verify someone's identity, because again, we know who's in the nursing home. It's not like it's Joe Smith, because obviously county nursing homes hold the sickest of the sick and the poorest of the poor. They still have a right to vote, but we know who they are. We aren't holding John Doe in the county nursing home. Because if we don't know who they are, we can't get payment for them.
Right. They all vote by absentee ballot. I think
I don't want to say all. Some, there are people in the nursing home who can come and go as they please, and they can go and vote. They may not. So the Hillsborough nursing home is in Goffstown. They may have maintained their voting rights, their domicile, in Amherst where they lived, and that is their right to do that. But they can switch it to Goffstown because that is where they live.
Um, could you explain that to me? So if they were previously domiciled in, and you said Amherst, well, let's use that example, and they're now, as a resident of Hillsborough County, they're now in the Hillsborough nursing home, even though they no longer have a physical presence in Amherst.
Some families choose to because let's say the person just physically resides at the Hillsborough County Nursing Home,
Right.
but they go and they spend every single day with their family in Amherst, and they're in the community in Amherst, and they're still very active in Amherst. That's where they want to vote, and as long as they still have a physical address there. So let's say it's the
Okay,
family
okay,
home,
all right,
they can
okay.
they can still vote there. If they move their physical address to Goffstown, they need to vote in Goffstown.
That's what, in case anybody is listening, I just want to make sure that's clear, is
Yes.
that because domicile is defined by physical presence. and
Correct.
Therefore, your explanation then of someone who maybe resides overnight
Yes.
in a Goffstown nursing facility, but in fact establishes most of their physical presence
Correct.
in the town of Amherst in this example, meets the domicile
Correct.
qualification in that circumstance. So, okay, thank you. That was helpful.
I believe Representative C. has a question.
Representative C, thank you.
I have a follow-up question for you, and this is probably more of an opinion than anything else. People who are disabled and confined to their home, not a nursing home, but just a private residence, how would you think they should be handled?
I think the current standard is sufficient because they're not leaving. The ballot is going to their home. Why should they need? It's unlikely. The likelihood of fraud, I think, is very low. And I don't speak for the disabled community, but I believe that they would agree with that statement.
Yeah, I think we've heard other testimony, and it's the issues with absentee ballot are more along the lines of confirming that the vote was done by the identified voter and not their neighbor or someone like that, and that and parallel to that is the chain of custody confirming that in fact that vote was done, it was sealed in a proper ballot and properly notarized as needed by RSA, and that way we're not someone who votes in person has their activities observed, and you can track a chain of custody by just witnessing the person walking to the various points. That is lost with the use of the absentee ballot. And so how do you compensate that so that you can treat both ballots equivalently? And so I think there is that aspect. And so I think part of what election law has to wrestle with is how do we make sure that that is equitable and the same standard is maintained. So I think that's the main concern that we have.
I would argue, Mr. Chair, putting back on my secure democracy hat and taking off my county hat for a minute.
Sure.
That just because you require someone to provide ID as an absentee ballot doesn't mean someone else didn't fill out that ballot. There's no proof. Even if you're sending in identification with that absentee ballot, that doesn't mean my neighbor still didn't fill out the ballot.
Right, and if that did happen, we should be aware of that, and we should have that
We should.
properly witnessed and notarized. And so I think,
Putting my county hat back on, please realize that notary costs money.
fortunately, the Secretary of State governs the notaries, and so there might be something we can do about that. Many states have made it a provision that election notarization of ballots is in fact a no-cost fee. So I think,
I would
But-
just
but
ask-
not a required service.
what's that?
But not a required service, is it? Do they require the notaries to
In
sign
those
those?
states?
They disallow charging, but they do not require the notary to take that action for those ballots. It's two different issues. One is charging for it, one is doing the action. The notary still has the option not to do
Okay.
that action when they're not getting paid for it.
Okay, I'm trying to remember of what I've read, if that's true in all states. I'm not sure that is.
Due to anti-slavery provisions in the Constitution, I doubt a state can force somebody to take an action and work for no payment.
Perhaps.
Yeah.
You can't
You can't
pro
can't
bono?
force pro bono. I'm sure that there are many people who are notaries who would
Right.
do it for free, but I do not think we can force them to do it for free. And we
Right.
can also authorize other people besides notaries to do it, such as these people in the nursing homes. And like we authorize the town clerks, because they're not, a lot of the town clerks
Right,
are
election
not,
officials.
Yes.
yeah, election officials are not official notaries.
Right.
So we
Yeah.
could authorize other people so that they don't have to be truly notaries and get that little official stamp.
And
yeah.
I think that's what I'm trying to suggest is that if you're going to require a notary, that please include the county superintendents and the county nursing home administrators as authorized approvers because they know who these people are. Because the town clerk is not going to drive over, in my example where I get arrested in Exeter and I'm held in Brentwood, the Manchester town clerk does not have time to come over and verify my identity. The corrections superintendent should be able to say, yes, she is who she says she is.
Agreed. I think, right, Representative C.
I was just thinking, we were just dealing with a bill for providing vouchers for people to get their birth certificates and things like that. Maybe that could also include getting a notary to witness somebody who cannot travel.
Yes, I think, again, I do believe that there are some states that maybe they have a nominal fee. And I think it was in Crawford versus Marion where they did not consider that to be an onerous burden on the voter. But nor did it, in case anyone was wondering, nor did it cross the threshold of a poll tax. So, all right. So I do appreciate the aspect that there are specific individuals that could be deemed for absentee ballots in these particular situations, election officials who would have the responsibility and authority to be able to authenticate a person. And without requiring a notary, I think a notary might be appropriate for those who are in other situations traveling, out of state on business, for example, something like that. Where again, that burden doesn't seem to be inappropriate to the privilege of voting. All right. Thank you. Ms. Organ. All right, I think we've tackled the two issues. Any further comments on issue 2 that aren't that haven't already been said? Yes. Not only it's been dead, it's the horse does not complain enough. That's right. All right, so let's move to issue 3, the non-resident voters. So again, as Representative Newsom has already pointed out, my problem statements may not always be perfectly worded, but I will endeavor to lay out the problem. So we have persons who use out-of-state identification, but they have a legitimate New Hampshire domicile. But once they either register or vote, and we heard testimony from the Secretary of State about this, they are obligated to fulfill the resident requirements, and there have been advisory opinions from the Supreme Court about that, as well as the 2020 case of Casey versus New Hampshire Secretary of State. There were 5 questions asked of the Supreme Court. They declined to answer the third one, but they did answer the other 5 or the other 4 of those 5. And one of them certainly, one if not more of them, alluded to the fact that, yes, once someone votes and exercises that domicile for voting purposes, then they are obligated to fulfill the resident obligations. However, we do know from testimony that we heard in the full House on House Bill 133 is that for those people who did use out-of-state identifications, there's only been an 80 or a 20 to 25%, something around those numbers. Don't hold me to exact numbers, please. But only a very, very minor percentage of those voters who have used an out-of-state identification have then followed through on those residency requirements. And that is a problem. That is a non-compliance. So, what's the problem is that our voting list potentially have people who have not fulfilled their resident obligations. And certainly if someone does this repeatedly, this is a willful disregard of the residency requirements. And I think something that could in fact constitute voter fraud. You're always looking for voter fraud. There you go. I've laid out a possible case for one.
One possible case.
Yes.
Which I may argue, but we'll get to that later.
So, and
I'm
we
being
do know,
quiet.
we do know in the last election that there were 4,812 out-of-state driver's licenses used. And so, again, I think
I'm
that's
sorry, what was that number again?
4,812. I believe that is correct. Approximately. And so, if we have only 20% of that complying, that would be, now I'm required to do high level math here. About 1,000. Yeah. So about 1,000. So that would, if these people failed to continue to act and continued to vote, there you would have.
And had a requirement to get a license.
And had a requirement to get a license. Or had already had a license. Then such persons would be potentially, again, I get a series of circumstances that they all have to come together. It has to be a perfect storm of concurrences. And I'm redundant there, sorry. Even so, at those point, I think we would have a legitimate case of voter fraud, or maybe inadvertent and unaware, but ignorance is not excuse, I suppose. All right, so what is the proposed solution, at least from my perspective. Well, I think first it's incumbent upon us to increase awareness of the residency requirements and implications. And I think it's also important that we identify the residency requirements on the voter registration forms that people sign, but without making the forms unnecessarily complex. I think the court case for SB3, I believe, had comments along those lines that SB3 had created complex registration forms and therefore made it difficult for voters to understand what they were signing. I think, we simply need to provide simple statements about your active registration and voting requires that you fulfill New Hampshire state residency requirements, which may include transferring a current driver's license to New Hampshire and other similar activities, something along those lines. I think one of the things that we could do and make it more clear in the RSA about these sorts of implications is to define some of these aspects under eligibility, and then specified in the voter qualifications and registration forms in those sections of the RSA as well. Again, without making them unnecessarily complex so as to make registration a burden. But so I would propose something maybe under eligibility to add something to the effect of the act of registration or voting requires the registrant or voter to comply with the residency requirements for New Hampshire. Compliance with New Hampshire residency requirements is considered a verifiable act of intent to make the place designated by the registrant a domicile as claimed. And then failure to comply with the residency requirements of New Hampshire law invalidates any claim to establish a physical place of presence with an intent to make that place a domicile, and renders the registrant as unqualified for the purposes of voting in future elections until as such time the residency requirements are met. Continued failure to comply with the residency requirements of New Hampshire law is considered a willful violation of the election laws of the state. Again, I think, I've tried to lay out a series of circumstances where one is, for whatever reason, they haven't complied. But compliance is not necessarily fraud. We had that discussion earlier today. And I'm not looking to cast aspersions on someone who has not been compliant as if they were committing fraud. I'm simply trying to distinguish between those two levels. But someone who continues to violate this is really at that point not just merely not complying, but actually committing voter fraud at that point. And so I think we need to be clear about this under the eligibility aspects, and then make the proper changes to the voter qualification and registration form sections of the RSA in order to address that. And so I would propose, for example, I'll try and provide some amendments to my Bill 289 to remove the aspects that we discussed earlier today, but then to add these sorts of residency requirements under eligibility. Again, explaining, domicile is what is needed to qualify, but that act of voting or registration then kicks in residency requirements, because I think that's fair. Representative Lane.
I guess I don't agree with you. I'll respectfully disagree.
Sure.
I do not think that the fact that you, if you satisfy and register and you show domicile and done everything, the fact that you choose not to get a New Hampshire driver's license, or that you choose to not get the non-driver identification should not take away your right to vote. which is the most important right you have. If you make those choices, it in no way is saying that you're committing fraud. All you're doing is not complying with other laws of New Hampshire. And if they want to share that list with DMV and DMV wants to go after those people for a violation of that law, go at it. But you don't take away people's right to vote simply because they don't go out to DMV and get a driver's license, or what other residency requirements are. I don't even know, because one of my questions was, what are the other residency requirements? And I'm not trying to be funny. I just honestly don't know if there are other ones that I'm not aware of. And, you know, like registering your car. Maybe a lot
vehicle
of people
registration,
don't
yeah.
have the money to register their car, and so they are forced to take the chance that they're not going to get caught. And I guess, you know, we all learn from our own experience, but, you know, I worked in legal aid for 9 years. I mean, my clients, they can't, I mean, trying to come up with $50 extra at the end of the week was a huge burden. Taking time off to go to the clerk's office or to go to DMV and stand in line for 2 hours is just something they can't do. Most of them are taking care of somebody, or they have mental health issues. I mean, there's a myriad of circumstances that, you know, fortunately, most of us don't have, but a lot of people in this state do. And it's been consistently, I can't remember who did this survey, but most people in the United States, and I don't know, I can't remember the percentage, but it's a really high percentage of people who don't have a $400 expense, unexpected, they can't cover it. So, which is why I get so worked up about the passport and all these extra costs, because a lot of people in our state do not have those. But that doesn't mean they shouldn't be able to vote. And so the more barriers and the more requirements we put up, the more people we are not allowing to vote. And I just don't, I think we have to think very carefully before we start saying, oh, because you didn't get a driver's license or you didn't register your car, you are not going to be allowed to vote. I'm not sure that would stand up in court, but, you know, I'm not a lawyer anymore, so I mean, I don't know, but I just think we have to think about those things before we go off and say, oh, let's do legislation about this. So, and one of the things I was thinking about with a lot of these bills is, should we retain them? And because, I mean, realistically, we have what, 2 weeks, a week, 5 days
Not much time.
to improve these bills in light of all that we've heard. So do we select a few to retain and work on them and get them at least to the point where you're not having to listen to me say this over and over again? So, thank you.
Yes, Representative C.
We do need to consider the possibility of people not having any photo ID at all, and it's not actually a requirement for living to have an ID. If they don't drive, if they don't own a car, if they don't need to go buy a beer, you know, they just don't need an ID. And they can legally live their life that way.
Yes, again, we run up against that kind of non-driver identification aspect. Representative Burnham.
I just had a comment to make because, I mean, with all these identifications, Social Security and all of that, when my children were still young and my oldest was about to get a job, a summer job, I realized I could not find their Social Security cards. In the midst of my whatever, I don't know what happened, because those are issued based upon the birth certificate, right? That all kind of happens at the same time. And then you don't use them unless you have insurance that you need to write down their Social Security number, and that's about it that I could recall.
Tax
Maybe
forms
if
for
you sent them
dependents.
to school, I'm not sure, but because I homeschooled. But however, so when I lost in my house their social security cards, and I knew I had to get this because in a few months she was going to start a job and she would need that. So I took my children to the social security office, which just getting inside was a complete circus with my children. So the problem that I came to is that I couldn't prove they were my children. I had their birth certificate with my name on it and their name on it, but I did not have a photo ID, which was kind of interesting because I thought, well, I mean, I homeschooled them. I didn't need a photo ID or school ID for them. So I can see why this is like an issue, proof of verification, but I had to go back a couple times. They were not willing to just give them a copy of their social security card. So, but I think that it's important why I say this. I think that we need to make sure that we're verifying people who are who they say they are when they're voting. It's just as important. What that answer is, what the final solution is, I'm not sure because we've kind of just run around and beat every possible idea, but it is very difficult to prove someone's identity, even if they were to create one themselves, because then that's not really government or legitimate. However, I think, could it be possible that, and I know this might be, I'm just throwing it out there, but wherever they are, and I'm excluding the county issue, but wherever the people are residing, is that something where they can maybe have some type of identity from the clerk's office? I mean, we're registering there, we pay for our dog licensing, which is coming up, and all this stuff. Like, is this another possibility that, if we are visiting there and, most people have driver's license, most people have this would be a rare few, but did this topic come up about possibly having some type of verification through the clerk's office? I thought I heard it somewhere. I can't really recall, but do you think this could be a possibility?
I think it was Mr. Clementowitz who brought it up in his testimony at one point. I don't remember which bill he was testifying on, but I think that's where I kind of got the idea when he mentioned something like that, but I don't know for sure.
Yeah.
I know I heard it, so thank you. I wasn't sure, but and the thing is, like, birth certificates you can get real easy now because
Yeah.
it's all been logged in. So
Well,
that pretty much, right? Like, it's on a database.
there are exceptions.
Yeah, okay. There's always exceptions. Not everybody lives the same. I get it. But I mean, that is available. So if there are those documents available and we can have something available at the clerk's office to verify, I don't know if that's another option to consider.
Representative Newsom.
According to my notes, that was on House Bill 618 when we heard that idea, and I don't know who it was from, but it was 618. It might have been you it might have been you bringing it up at the time too, but it was worthy enough that I wrote a note about it.
So I think, and I'm doing this from memory, but if I'm not mistaken, in some of the court cases that we heard about, there was some discussion that at one point there were some states that limited, or that historically limited their wards to 250 people, so someone could ostensibly know everyone there. Those days perhaps are gone, but I think even so, I think that's an interesting aspect of, if we're wanting someone to be identified at a ward, then what can we do to facilitate the identification at that ward through the town clerk or the clerk's office? That is an interesting aspect. So, all right. Representative Newsom, follow up there.
Thank you. On slightly different, well, on the sheet, believe it or not, I'm actually going to have something good to say about it. On under proposed solution, you have the increased awareness of resident requirements and implications. I think that's a great idea, and I don't know if it would be as simple as a handout that the ballot clerks could give somebody when they do use that out-of-state ID.
That's a great idea.
Something like that
Yeah.
would be great. And then getting back to Representative Lane's comments about how a DMV violation shouldn't rise to where the penalty should not be to remove your right to vote. I guess another way that I was kind of thinking that through, and an analogy would be that you get a speeding ticket
Right.
and you're no longer allowed to possess a firearm.
Interesting.
That it's a DMV violation and a constitutional right being taken away. And
I like that analogy, actually. I do.
I doubt anyone would feel confident and
Right.
comfortable with a speeding ticket taking away your right to gun ownership.
Right.
I know I wouldn't want my guns taken away over a speeding ticket. So
Yes. Yes. I do appreciate that. How do we deal with this issue of ongoing noncompliance?
that's the challenge. And I think that's the DMV. And I don't know if there are ways to communicate that back and forth through local level reports up to the Secretary of State, who then talks to DMV. And again, the other problem is that, as the testimony we heard, is that just because you don't get the New Hampshire driver's license doesn't mean you're not in compliance. That there are certain circumstances of not driving in the state, not owning a car in the state, where you can be residents, domiciled, whatever
Right.
words they all are, that may or may not be the same. Even with all that, you still don't need to have a New Hampshire driver's license. I think, as Representative C said, you don't need an ID to live your life. So again, not getting one it is not prima facie evidence of violations. So it is a challenge, and I just don't know what the answer is, and I certainly don't think we can come up with an answer in the next week to make a bill amendment to solve that this term.
Does, thank you for that comment. Does yeah, so it's funny, by law, we've combined the concepts of domicile and resident, but then we need to continually separate them for enforcement purposes, oddly enough, because as you said, the domicile can be maintained and someone can, the domicile could be maintained for voting purposes. They still have their physical presence, but their failure to comply with resident requirements at that point has to be sort of distinguished from the constitutional right to vote.
Yeah, the way I think about it is, what is the definition for voter registration or voter residency as opposed to other types? So DMV residency, UNH residency, so that term can be used in a lot of different contexts and doesn't always mean the same thing. And I think I know I tend to want to lump things like resident means resident in the same thing in every single situation, but that's really not what we have. And I think that's why they finally gave up and said domicile and residence with respect to voting are the same. But it's not the same when you look at DMV or UNH, whether you're going to get to pay in-state tuition or not. And there's probably other ones out there. I just don't know. But it's we shouldn't fall into the trap of trying to say that the word resident or residency or whichever one we're using means the same thing in every context. And I think that's part of the education process for everybody. And I think handing out that thing might be a good idea and to educate people. And it could also be that the SOS and DMV can work together to do something like that. I don't know if they have a link or not. I can't figure that out.
I think they do. I think also that House Bill 133 was meant to address some of these aspects. So, all right. So I think, but those are valid points. The residency has multiple definitions. Or you, that's not the right way to say it. Maybe is you can have multiple residencies, but for voting purposes, you can't have multiple domiciles. It's confusing. So, Representative C.
I know we have a provision in the RSA stating that voting domicile for voting purposes, but that always sort of annoyed me because, as I see it, you can only have one domicile for all your purposes, and you can change it whenever you need to, but at any one given time, you can only have one. But that's just my feeling. I don't know whether there's any legal basis for that.
So it's very interesting if you read through, like for instance, tax law. You can have someone who has a temporary absence from an address for education purposes. And you can have, I think there's a reference where you can have I think this is in the RSAs as well. You can have a domicile for voting purposes and also have a temporary absence from that domicile.
But that's, yeah, the services.
I
guess the
armed
most-
services.
Yeah, armed services is usually the one that most people ring up, or people who go do residencies, doctors who go do
Right.
residencies, and what's the other example they always come up with? I can't remember.
But, and I mean, yeah, I think it's, and because each state implements these things independently with just having to align as required with federal requirements, if they're applicable or not. Again, it's very confusing for that reason, because I don't think other states are wrestling with, they don't use the word domicile. Let me put it that way. There are other states that don't use the word domicile. So, and maybe that's part of it. We need to think about how we change that. I think that's what really is behind the suggestion by Mr. Richard for moving toward a New Hampshire citizen voter. All right, are there any other comments on the non-resident voter issue that
My-
haven't been said before?
That this hasn't been said before. I'm not sure that the term non-resident voters is good, because if you're not a resident, you shouldn't be voting. So it kind of implies. So I would just say, I don't know. I don't know what title I would come up with, but when I first read it, I went, how can we have non-resident voters? If they're a non-resident voter, then they're committing fraud.
Well, how can we have voters who are voting in New Hampshire who use out-of-state identification?
Because they're just proving who they are. They're not proving that they can prove that they live in New Hampshire in other ways. The ID is just to show who they are.
Representative C.
Possibly the title could be voters with non-resident identifications.
Yes, I, I inherited that title, because that was the subcommittee's title given to me, just so you know. So just, I do try and be very careful in my wording, but sometimes I inherit things that are,
Well, we are trying to make sure that the non-resident voters don't vote in our state.
exactly. All right,
While allowing the residents to vote in the state.
yes. Yes, absolutely. All right. So we've talked about those three things. Let's the fourth one is absentee ballots. All right, so I think again, this is just my perception thinking about this late at night, but trying to take into account all the testimony we've heard, the court cases I've reviewed, the research that we've been presented. Currently, and we did hear the Secretary of State testify that he felt that there were some aspects of the absentee ballot process. I won't say registration and obtaining a ballot, but that may be, and we heard Mr. Richards' testimony about the affidavit aspects of that could be tightened up. So I think the problem I see is that absentee ballots may currently be obtained by non-registered voters. So they can request a ballot even if they haven't registered yet. I believe that's correct. And then they have to provide that proof of, they have to provide the qualifications. Again, I have to confirm that, but I think that's possible.
But I thought there was a process to register absentee, which is separate and distinct from requesting the absentee ballot. And this is
Yes.
again one of the, and I found the same issue when I was going through this stuff,
Yes.
is conflating the different
two,
steps in the
yes.
process between registration, requesting the ballot, and then returning the ballot
Yes.
as different things.
Yeah.
And it is hard to keep track of.
Yeah, well, I mean, I don't want to suggest something wildly crazy, but I think it might be helpful at some point to even think, much as you did with the finance aspects last year, is to just think about a overhaul where we would distinguish, yeah, I know, sorry, where we would distinguish those two activities more clearly than the RSAs do now. Because I do think there is confusion about that. And all right, so, so without an election official sign off, a clerk signing an envelope for a voter submitting for example, a clerk signing it, like I've done this in my own town. I know I was going to be away on business travel. I went in the week prior, obtained an absentee ballot, filled it out there, signed all the necessary forms, and handed it directly to the clerk. So, there was full chain of custody, full identification. I had already registered, so no issues there. But as we heard from Mr. Richards' testimony, there are some absentee ballots that don't have a formal confirmation of the voting by the identified voter. There's a self-attestation, I think is how he characterized it. But there's not a third party, such as an election official, public notary, other individuals who might be, we certainly heard from Ms. Horgan, county corrections administrators, nursing home administrators who might be able to do something in those situations. could authenticate that that voter made, and again, for someone who was disabled, because we do want to take into account that situation, that they could indicate their vote to a third party who then completed the ballot on their behalf, and then again had all of that documented so that, or sufficiently documented so that it was shown very clearly that the circumstances of that vote has in authenticity and integrity, and it's documented, and the moderator, when they receive that absentee ballot and then have to count those votes, can verify that as appropriate. All right. So again, the two aspects are simply that there's not a formal confirmation of the voting by the identified voter, and there's a loss of any chain of custody confirming the integrity of the absentee ballot. What's the adverse impact is that the integrity of some absentee ballots is suspect when there's a lack of the confirmation or an insufficient chain of custody. Some possibility things would be absentee voters must pre-register in person. Now, again, I think we would have to take into account the corrections facilities, nursing homes, things like that. If the absentee voter fails to provide the documents necessary for registration, what would we do? Would we treat them like a UOCAVA voter? Quite possibly, because at that point, there's no other choice. We don't want to deny them the opportunity to vote, but simply, we don't have all the documentation necessary. So I do think, especially after Mr. Richards' testimony, I do think we need to explore creating a voter authentication affidavit envelope, something that election official or a public notary or a corrections facility administrator or a nursing home facility administrator could sign and thereby identify what that the voting has occurred properly. So I think those are, I think the two things is, we modify the envelope, and I apologize, my computer key for E is giving me problems, and I see all the typos here, and I apologize for that, but it's like, again, some of them, envelope is a word, but it was meant to be envelope. So if you see under proposed changes, so it was not caught by spell check, unfortunately.
Good old spell check.
Yeah, and the is still a word from the Old English language. So again, things not caught during spell check. So I think those are the two things that I see as helping to improve the absentee ballot situation. There are changes that would have to be made in a number of cases. I think there's good support in some of the other cases referenced. Again, it was starting to get very, very late at that point. And so, additional considerations is to limit the deadline for receiving absentee ballot requests by mail, simply because there's not time to return it at that point, and require a completed registration prior to dispensing with an absentee ballot. I probably do need to double check that again. I may have conflated registration with obtaining a ballot, but for the absentee ballot aspects. So I think those are some potential solutions along those lines. Thoughts and comments? Representative Burnham.
Yes, I do have a comment. This actually occurred Tuesday, and I hope that I'm speaking on this in the proper way that I saw it. Was I was helping with the absentee ballots. as far as getting them prepared. And one individual had requested an absentee ballot the Monday prior, which is fine. However, was not a registered voter, so then had to come in Tuesday to register and then provide her absentee ballot. So I kind of thought it was a little strange. I mean, obviously this may not happen very often, but is that proper procedure if she came in to register but still submitted the absentee ballot?
I would think that when they show up in person, they should be tossing their absentee and getting a same day, quote unquote, regular is what I would think. But as school moderator, I don't deal with elections the way that the town moderator does. I'm still the election official and do the counting, but that kind of call would be the town moderator's call, at least in my town. But that's an interesting scenario. Thanks for sharing that one.
Yeah, and he did call it. He checked on it and verified. Yep, she registered and they accepted the absentee ballot. But I just
And-
thought I felt the same way. If you could come to register, why not just vote? But
And
that
in-
was just kind of one of those really strange things that happen with
But
an
in theory,
absentee
it's the
ballot.
same questions, the same ovals. So
Yes.
it's kind of a no difference in the end that the ovals are still getting counted the same way, but it is an odd situation. And I think less important in a town where the ballots are the same, but if some of the other balloting pre-certificate questions come into play, that could have different answers and could be, I would almost suggest your moderator reach out to the municipal association and add that to the training seminar, because that is an interesting one that I bet happens elsewhere too.
Yeah, I think there are some questions about whether you would treat that as the absentee ballot as a spoiled ballot at that point. And then void that and then request the person to vote in person. Again, plans change, so it's, if someone thought they would be away and filled it out with yeah, so right. So there's a lot of how did they get a ballot without registering? See, so that's what I'm concerned about. Someone got an absentee ballot and they weren't
I
registered.
did ask the clerk that. I said, then why did you give a ballot if they weren't registered? I don't understand. I might be missing something, but that's just the scenario that was presented.
One. No, I'm just kidding. No, that is a very serious problem, and I don't mean to diminish that at all, but
I
Yeah.
mean, obviously that would have been checked by the supervisor checklist that morning who goes through to verify the absentee ballots. But I just thought, why would that be even entertained from the beginning?
Right. It
possibly a similar name with somebody already on the registry.
Yeah. The mechanism.
I'm not going to
should-
speculate beyond that, but
Right. The mechanism should be no ballots unless registered. So, Representative C, I know you have some ideas here that you want to share with us.
Well, first I wanted to follow up on the conversation we were just having
Please
here.
do.
Is my understanding of the reason for having the absentee ballots processed after like 11 a.m. or some particular time is so that a person who thought they were going to be away, mailed in an absentee ballot, but then is able to come in, can come in before the absentee ballots are started, and they can mark them as being voting in person instead of absentee.
That's my understanding too. Isn't it possible though that you can still, I've been reading all these new statutes, so I'm a little, the existing statute, can you not, because I know we heard testimony from a couple of the clerks that they send them to people by email. I mean, that they're requested by email. So it could be that under the existing law, that they ask for the full package, registration and everything. And then, I don't know, it just, I can't remember what I'm embarrassed to say, I
No,
cannot remember.
it is complicated. It gets conflated, and I think we need to review that and make sure that we separate those two activities for absentee ballots more clearly, so that I do think that fraud could occur. I want to be careful in my phrasings for the esteemed representatives to my left. I want to, so it is important that an absentee ballot never be sent out to someone who is not registered. Because that has a potential for fraud. And and that theoretically could happen, again, for very ostensibly good purposes, but that is a way that fraud could be introduced, and therefore more easily introduced, and therefore we should do things to mitigate the potential of it occurring. And so with that in mind, I think it's important that we do clarify that. Now, Representative C has some ideas here to share with us. I understand Representative Burnham has to leave. Thank you very much. If you have any further suggestions or possible amendments to this, please let us know. And we will be, I don't know if you caught this early on, we will be meeting Tuesday morning at 9. The only problem I see is we may not be meeting here. So we'll figure out where we're meeting. Who knows?
The closet over here.
Yeah, quite possibly. But and then I will see if I can get a more fuller report out this weekend or on Monday, and we'll try and review it. If I am able to do this by sometime over the weekend, I really encourage people to get comments back to me offline, so that we can review as complete a report as we possibly can on our Tuesday meeting with recommendations for the committee.
Can I just make another comment?
Please.
I just want to thank you for putting that report together. It kind of really helped narrow the issues and put them in order. So it's it's tough. It's sometimes things web together, and I'm very thankful that you did that. So thank you for giving that information like that.
I hope I thank you, Representative Burnham. I do hope that the subcommittee finds it useful. I've tried to really analyze and synthesize the issues into as concise a document as possible. And while I may have failed with some of my problem statements and solutions,
It's always easier to edit than it is to do the initial draft. And so I do thank you. It gave us a good place to start, kind of coalescing.
Thank you. I do appreciate that. I do think these are the 4 issues that we're wrestling with by and large. There may be other nuances, but anyway, I do want to, again, Representative Burnham, thank you. Representative C, you have some thoughts on the chain of custody for absentee ballots. Would you please discuss that or introduce that to us and discuss it, please?
Okay. This is not as it's in current RSAs. This is what I was trying to piece together and then putting in what I thought was the use of a notary. And you can see where it's in there. But basically, when the clerk mails out a absentee ballot package, at that point it's in the post office or whatever delivery agent is using it. There's no real chain of custody on that. When the voter receives the ballot package, if they then go to a notary public, then you can say that the chain of custody resumes, because when the voter is with the notary public can verify the person's identification, and that the ballot is blank. Haven't been given a previously marked ballot or anything like that. And also, I would think the notary should at least attempt to confirm that the ballot is the correct ballot for that person. They obviously aren't going to be able to prove it, but if I ask for one, does it say the town of Loudon? Does it say the March 11th
The date,
Um,
election date.
town election or whatever it is? And then while the voter is there, but not where the notary can see them actually mark the ballot, they should mark the ballot, refold it, put it in the inner envelope, and then the notary can then verify all the information on the affidavit and put the notary seal on it. And that provides a chain of custody with the notary seal, because when it gets back to the town and to the moderator, when he or she is ready to process the ballot, they can check to see that the envelope is still sealed, the notary certificate is all filled out, and they know that the person has been identified and that there is a ballot inside the envelope. So that's the chain I was looking at. And I noted up there, the notary public or other recognized legal witnesses, and I jotted down some possible legal witnesses below. Obviously, we just talked about nursing home administrators, also long-term, for somebody who's long-term hospitalization, some hospital administrator. We haven't identified how to handle people who are homebound. But so that list can be added to and probably needs to be codified to be legitimate. But that was just my thoughts on trying to keep track of the chain of custody on the ballots. All the regular ballots, there is a chain of custody process already prescribed in RSAs. Whether it's what we think it ought to be or not, that's, they may need adjustment too, but I didn't try to address that in this particular statement.
Thank you, Representative. See, I think that's very helpful. I think this is a good list of, I think this is a good process as you've outlined. And I think the identification of a starting group of legal witnesses is very helpful as well.
And I,
Yes,
I think I put for somebody out of the country, I don't know whether embassies or other state State Department functions have notary publics, or what they call them, or whether it be the charge d'affaires or the ambassador himself, or
Yeah,
who knows.
I know they have, they don't call them notaries, but I know that there is a term and I
they
can't
administer
remember.
oaths.
Yeah,
Yes, right. Yeah, and maybe that's wording we could use. Someone who is capable of administering an oath might be another term that we could use to capture people that can serve as witnesses to the.
Yeah, because I don't think we want to limit it to State Department staff.
Right.
Because I know, like, where my kids went to school in Scotland, the nearest consulate was over 3 hours away.
Right.
So that could be problematic from an access point, but I'm sure that they would have some other person to administer oaths.
Is that something we can ask our crack legal researcher to do? to find out.
So if you want to phrase the question, Representative Lane or Representative Mish?
I think we want to know how to express the fact that the equivalent of a notary or an official witness is in another country. And I don't, if it's somebody in the State Department, maybe, want to maybe include them, but are there other terms that we should be looking at rather than just a charge d'affaires or, you certainly don't want to have to be the ambassador, but I mean, something along, does that make, am I? Yes. You said it much better than I did. Thank you.
Yeah, so I will send a request to Chairman Barry and he will forward it to you. I'll copy you on the original request, but it will be directed to Chairman Barry and he'll approve it. And again, I think even if it's completed after the subcommittee report is done, I think it still can be included as evidence and that would be helpful. Because I think we do want to try and take into account as much of this as possible. All right. Well, thank you very much, Representative C.
A quick question, with the notary seal, a lot of those, but not all, are raised. And would that, on the ballot itself, because if it's going through the envelope and everything, it's going to catch top and bottom and hit the intermediate ballot. Would that create problems for the voting machines?
Perhaps we could have a statement if notarizing the envelope uses an embossed seal, that the embossing should be done
On the flap
prior
on
to
the flap prior to sealing or something like
prior
that?
to including the envelope so as
Yeah.
not to damage, or prior to including the ballot so as not to
Something like, yeah,
damage
we
the
can,
ballot.
we can
Some-
work
yeah,
on that down the road.
something like that. But
Yeah.
yeah, I think we should include some provision for that probably.
My initial thought on that was maybe to have the envelope have a large flap, a full-size flap that could be notary seal on it, and then the gum seal on it.
Good.
As long as it's considered.
Yeah.
Thank you. I appreciate your thoughts on that, and sort of having this list is very helpful in kind of seeing the process. And I like it a lot because it doesn't, and I know this was a concern of yours during committee testimony, is not to have duplicative identification process through the process. And I greatly appreciate your work on that. Thanks.
All right. I think just this discussion points paper, I think the only thing is that I think I need to do some serious work on page 1 based upon the testimony from Representative Lynn, who, as everyone should know, was a former New Hampshire Supreme Court Justice. So,
And Chief Justice.
and Chief Justice. So he does not come, he is certainly much more qualified to talk about legal aspects than myself. And so I really respect his opinion and was very glad that he could stop by this morning. What I'd like to do is put together a more fuller narrative supporting these discussion points as well. I think I can do that over the weekend. I hope. And then give that to, revise this based upon comments, and then give that to everyone for review. And then hopefully, I would say late Sunday night, that would give the subcommittee Monday to review, and then I could make any revisions, and then we could discuss the completed report Tuesday morning.
So you think the report's going to be something along these
Do you,
lines?
let me ask you, if I had a narrative sort of, and then this was one of the attachments, I would talk about these at a high level, and then include something like this as an attachment that would discuss it.
Yeah. I just wasn't sure.
Yeah,
Okay.
I'm not sure either, quite frankly, but I,
You're in charge.
but I'm an engineer, and I find that kind of breaking this down helps me to understand it. Not that I get every point right, but then it's easier for people to point out where I'm wrong, actually, because it's been identified. So I think from that aspect, I do think it helps to some degree.
And then, so that's the report aspect. And then do we go back and say, give them a recommendation for each of the bills that we have? Or, I'm fairly certain that most of the Republicans will not be voting for my bill.
That is quite possible.
385. I bet a lot of money on that one. But I do have an amendment, and I do have, something. So I don't know if there's other amendments to these that we're going to expect and we want to fix, or do we want to ask people to retain them, or, because I'm just saying it's a
So-
lot of work to get done.
Right.
But if you want to tackle that, unfortunately, I think you're on 3 different bills. And you have 1 or 2.
Yeah.
I only have 1.
Yeah, but it's the longest one. Do you, so I'll reach out to Representative Burnham, but I would say if you have recommendations for any of the bills or amendments you would like to make, if you could make those to me by, noonday Sunday. And then what I will do is I will consolidate all the input and go from there, and try include that in the report as much as possible. Okay, so I do think it will help us, because if there are some, I'll use the term euphemistically, bad bills, we could be able to identify them and as possible amend them prior to Tuesday. And likewise, if there are some that are bad bills that cannot be amended, we can propose an ITL out of the subcommittee for the full committee. Or if there is something that we think, yes, this has possibilities, but we need more time to work on it. And I think we could have additional recommendations for things to do. And there's always next year, but
Right.
I think,
Because I think
Yeah.
I think also one of the things they asked us to do is to see if there was something we could combine. So it might be that we work on one, but the other 2 that are on the same subject.
right.
So I could see that. I think,
Yeah.
there's 2 or 3 that are on one.
Yeah,
subject.
we could, in fact, it might be a good idea to consolidate and then retain the other 2, for example. That way, that would give us options. That's another possibility. But I think, yeah, I think that's good. So, lots to think about. Anyway, all right. I will go around the room at this point. So we're getting, thank you all for your indulgence. We're a few minutes over. But let's go around the room and I'll take any final comments. Representative Newsom.
I think today was a very productive day. At least it felt that way. More so than it's always nice to kind of move the thoughts and bills and concepts forward instead of just a day of getting information in. That the real synthesis of that was very helpful and I think really moved the ball forward quite a bit today. And I appreciate everyone's efforts. Thank you.
Thank you. Representative C.
Just to reiterate, I think we did get some organization here. I find it helpful to have stuff on paper. Your 4-page list was very helpful in starting to focus our attention on the particular aspects that really need to be formalized.
Thank you. Representative Lane.
I would just echo both Representative Newsom and Representative C's comments. I don't have anything to add.
Very good. I thank you. I do want to really help people focus in on the issues. So I'm glad that this has been fruitful. I will just reiterate that I think some of my thinking may have been an error because there are certain aspects of the National Voter Rights Act that had been referenced in other court cases, and I thought they could possibly extend, but as Representative Lynn, former Chief Justice, clarified for us that the act is fully excludable to New Hampshire because we still have maintained that election day registration aspect. We haven't ever stopped it like Maine did and then had to comply with both aspects, which they clearly Maine did not think that through thoroughly. So I think there's a lot of rework that I have to do on page 1 because the premise is the problem statement is incorrect. And so that one aspect is not something that we have to necessarily comply. And then there are aspects where I think it's in Crawford versus Marion, but the federal government does have to defer to the states for control of elections. And so that is something to consider. So I just bear in mind that page 1 will certainly need a lot of revision. I want to thank everybody today for their contributions, a lot of thoughtful statements, a lot of good analysis and critiques of everything was provided, and I think it's been good. Really appreciate the 4 meetings that we've had so far. Hopefully we can do a wrap up on Tuesday morning, and there's a lot of time, or maybe not so much time between now and then, but we'll see what we can do. Again, I think I'm sort of looking at maybe a 10 to 12 page report with maybe this as an attachment or embedded within that. These may become like figure 1s if they're inside the report, or addendums if they're outside the report. We would also include Mr. Allen's memos, as well as the written testimony from Mr. Richard. And he is, by the way, he is. We're going to include all of that? No, we're not going to include all the exhibit. So we will make those available, but not as part of the report. But okay. I do want to include his 14-page testimony as part of the report. So, because I think it was very, his explanations were extremely helpful, and I think actually added onto the Secretary of State's statements about the gaps in the absentee ballot. Mr. Richards' testimony really helped me think about that aspect much more clearly, and I think helped me understand the affidavit situation better. And so I think it's helpful if we include that, but not all the exhibits, but make the exhibits available as part of the documentation received by the committee. All right, any final comments? Yes?
Sorry, I just, your comments there made me, just jarred my memory, and I sure hope we've said this before, but I'll say it again if we have. And I'd just like to get in the record to thank researcher Mr. Allen over there and all of his labors
Yes.
and quick responses to all of our questions. And just thank you very much for all your work here.
Yes. Fortunately, you are paid more than we are. So that are you hiring? There you go. Very good. Yes. I think the whole subcommittee echoes what Representative Newsom. We thanked you in emails, but for the public testimony, we should thank you very much. We do appreciate the diligent research, and it's been quite helpful. So very good. All right. With that, we will adjourn the meeting and see you Tuesday morning, 9 o'clock. All right.